get started. So the idea for this workshop came up quite recently with the recognition that there's this big concept that's captured in Animal Rebellion's principles and values. There's this concept that in our number one principle and value, that we are an anti-speciesist movement with a shared vision of change. And there was a recognition that this is so essential to what we do, and there's a need, and therefore there's a need to kind of unpack what does speciesism mean to Animal Rebellion and for Animal Rebellion, and how does it kind of come to play with the way we see climate justice and animal justice, and the way we kind of shape our movement around that. So today we're kind of going to touch on these ideas of kind of what is speciesism, but also why it matters to the climate movement, why Animal Rebellion kind of tries to build this bridge between the two movements, why they're so intrinsically connected. So why kind of the connection and relationship to animals is so why we believe it's so connected to our relationship to the earth and our kind of climate activism. I'm just gonna try and make just trying to make my computer work. No, it's not gonna work for me, that's okay. Here we go. So the way we interact with animals is such an essential part of our life, regardless of where we live in the world, regardless of our kind of job or circumstance or situation, animals end up being all around us. So, it might be the birds that we hear outside our window, might be the dogs and cats or mice or bunnies who we share our homes with, or it might be the insects who crouch unseen behind furniture and share our homes and every kind of aspect of our lives. We interact with animals both in our physical world, so when we're going for a walk and a squirrel runs across our path, but we also interact with animals in our metaphorical and symbolic world. So from the language that we use when we say, we've had such a dog of a day or something like that, to the toys we give children, to the colloquialisms we use to describe bad situations. We refer to and evoke the bodies and behaviors of animals. And at the same time, and this is something that we're all, I think, deeply aware of, humanity has spent recent centuries creating carefully built walls of language and attitude and assumption and architecture, which serve to distance ourselves from non-human animals and which normalize a system of exploitation. And this pervades all areas of our life. And I think this is something that we all see and realize when we're trying to fight for the climate and trying to fight for animals, that the system is made to keep us separate from these non-human aspects of the world. And this system is kind of part of what we call speciesism. And I think it's important to note there's a deeply rooted and entrenched, but also it's a constructed system of dominance. And today we'll be trying to unpack this construction of how we relate to animals and what it might mean for us and how we can kind of think about it in new ways. So as I said, it's deep-rooted, it's entrenched, but I think the most important one for me here is that it is a constructed system. This relationship we have towards other animals, towards non-human animals, is not inherently or intrinsically natural. And like I said, again, this is something I think we're all aware of, that the way we relate to those who aren't human isn't natural, and it doesn't feel natural, but it can be often difficult to articulate why it is the way it is. So I could start, by having kind of, an activity where we all think about, what makes a human life worthy. And, we might all chuck out words like intelligence. We might say compassion and empathy. We might say comprehension of the future, hopes, dreams, love. We might even just say just existence, like existence is enough to make a life worthy. And then I could, talk through all the ways that animals show these qualities. And this might include chickens who pass down cultural knowledge, to elephants who grieve, and to fish who use tools. But I'm not going to do that. And the reason I'm not going to do that is because I do believe that every one of you here, at least on some level, knows that there is nothing that makes humans intrinsically superior to any other species. And I think we're all here because we want to think about how our relationship to animals, like how we can think about it on a different level, how we can think about it as and understand it as being connected to all these other things that we see in the world and all these other systems. So what I'm going to talk about instead is a form of systemic structural oppression that is built into our system and which allows these systems to function the way that they do. Something. Yeah.
Right. You're sharing the speaker's notes, not the.
Oh, sorry about that. Hope everyone enjoyed my speaker's notes. 1 sec. Thanks, Jam. There we go. How's that?
Yeah, all good.
Cool. Sunday afternoon, hey? Okay, how's that? Yep.
Yeah, good.
Cool, thank you so much. Sorry, everyone. So these systems allow our system to function the way they do. And something else that everyone in this room probably already knows, that our system is not broken because it contributes to destruction. At the moment, the system that we live in was built to destroy, and it was built to exploit, and it is operating as planned. And what we might not know is how the dominance of animals and the treatment of them as lesser than, what we call speciesism, has been a core part of this system we seek to change since the very beginning, since its inception. So before we dive in, and before I hand over to Jam in a second to talk a little bit about the concept of speciesism 101, I thought, it might be helpful to kind of introduce myself a little bit more, and kind of answer the question of who am I to talk about this? And like I said, I'm not an expert, and like I said, Jam and I, neither of us are claiming to be experts on this, but I have a history, I have a reason that this is a topic that I'm really passionate about and that I really care about. And like a lot of people, I grew up surrounded by animals. I grew up surrounded by dairy farms, actually, down in the country in rural Australia. And for most of my life, I never questioned the way we interacted with animals. I never questioned the relationships we had with animals. I lived with a lot of animals. I rode horses. I had this care and love for animals in my life. And I never questioned whether there was a different model, there was a different way of conceptualizing how we related. And I never questioned the idea that in some ways I was superior to other animals. And then I started to encounter this idea. And I started to encounter this idea that model of relationships might not be the only one out there. So I started to read a lot and look into this. But I think the biggest thing is I started to question my relationships with the animals around me. And I started to see connections that I just hadn't seen before. So that picture on the left, that's a picture of me with a dog named Axel. He was a dog I met in Palestine at the Palestinian Animal League. And the reason I put this picture there is because this was a moment where a deeper understanding of speciesism, like what I'm hoping to kind of talk about today, really rose up in me. So basically at this place where this dog was, it was in the middle of Palestine, and there was a deep-rooted fear of dogs in a local community because of ways that dogs have been used by the army to build fear in people. So what this group, the Palestinian Animal League, recognized was that people would be scared of dogs, so they would beat the dogs, like street dogs who lived on the street. And then those same people, so these were kids who would do this, these same people would then grow up to enact violence on their family, and it became this kind of cycle of violence, where violence towards animals, which came out of violence towards children, then led to, you know, domestic violence. So what this group started to do was they started to introduce children to dogs that they had been rescued, and kind of build these relationships and break down that fear barrier. And what they noticed was that in doing so, violence in the community started to fall. So as I was saying before, it's like this was a moment where I really started to see how our relationship to animals does not exist in a vacuum. It's connected to our relationship to other humans. It's connected to our relationship to the planet. And I started to understand how, if we understand why we relate to animals the way that we do, we can understand a lot more about the world, and we can also work to build ways of challenging these systems, and building new systems that aren't built on the same kind of forces of oppression. So yeah, a couple of months later, after I was in Palestine with that dog, Axel, on the picture on the right is me getting arrested for this very cause, for this belief that there are different ways. There's different ways of relating to animals. There's different ways to kind of existing in this world. And this is like a fundamental belief that I have. And I'm really glad to see so many other people here to kind of be having this conversation. And yeah, I think it's the conversations that we need to be having. So I'm going to pass on to Jam to talk us through some ways that speciesism can manifest itself. And then we're going to start like diving deeper into how we can start to understand this differently.
Cool. Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, just a quick introduction to myself as well. I'm Jam. I'm in Animal Rebellion also. I'm also no expert on speciesism, but I'm going to not touch too much on like the philosophy or the thinking behind speciesism, but yeah, as Harley mentioned, just go through like the really key concepts, but then also sort of show how it manifests itself in certain ways in reality systemically, and also in the way we think and the way that we treat animals. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, Holly. Cool, thank you very much. So the word speciesism was coined in 1970 by a British psychologist called Richard Ryder. 5 years later, Peter Singer from Australia actually defined it as, well, elaborated on it with the definition of a prejudice or bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. So this was when the term speciesism was coined, but speciesism actually sort of existed long before 1970, and the way I see it is it sort of stemmed from like really sort of human-centered thinking, which these days is called anthropocentrism, and that's the belief that human beings are the most important entity in the universe. And yeah, the Wikipedia quote goes on to say that anthropocentrism interprets or regards the world in terms of human values and experiences. So it's basically looking through everything through a human lens and sort of disregarding any other species and making the world in a way that only favors humans at the expense of the non-human animals. But then also things like anthropocentrism, just sort of this privilege of human existence over everything else, has led to sort of quite a few other oppressions as well. So like quite a few bad things, in my opinion, have sort of come out of this. And so yeah, there's a picture there of, I think that's New York City, where there's like some birds on top of the traffic light pole, where things like urban design and things like that and are sort of really human focused, and it forces non-human animal species to have to adjust and adapt or move or worse. So yeah, that's just like an example of how speciesism sort of manifests itself in sort of the human urban environment. But then if we now look at the next slide, we have sort of these conceptions of animals using sort of like a value system, which was created by humans, which puts non-human animal species sort of on a spectrum of essentially like their worth, because that's sort of a very human concept. So just some really basic examples. So where we have like the domesticated dog considers to be like man's best friend, mainly because they provide sort of fun and love and sort of a social element which a human can relate to closely. There's another type of speciesism which favors species which are closer to humans, which resemble humans as well. So where, like, for example, a primate will be considered as almost human or kind of human or sharing loads of human traits will be considered to have higher worth or higher value compared to like another animal, like for example the jellyfish, which purely based on some factors that humans have made to judge things might be considered as like an alien species, or there's even some argument that because for certain physiological reasons, jellyfish might not even be animals at all. So it's just sort of judging things on this basis of this construct of human thought that was created to create basically an artificial hierarchy of species, which also then not transcends, but is similar to other forms of oppression as well. We then also have sort of like the demonization of certain animals. So we have the shark, where it's considered to be deadly or dangerous and stuff, and they're sort of known for killing a certain amount of people per year, whereas actually humans kill way more sharks than sharks kill like all the time. So there's a sort of way of spotlighting an animal in quite a negative way when it shouldn't be. Move on to the next slide. So speciesism then also manifests itself systemically as well. When sort of some thinking was formed by like some philosophers and some thinkers a long time ago, essentially reducing a lot of animals down into machines with no feelings and no compassion, no sort of intrinsic humanistic traits. It sort of justified the use of animals as machines in the system. So here we have donkeys being made to work against their will, and this is just one of the ways that speciesism manifests itself systemically as well. And then we have the big one, which is animals as food. So yeah, I think we're all like really familiar with this one. We're going to touch on this one a little bit later on how how this sort of doesn't really make much sense, even sort of on a global scale. But what we do have, which I believe to be the result of speciesism, is loads and loads of non-human animal lives being oppressed and tortured and then eventually murdered just for some food for humans, which which is of course speciesism then also manifesting itself in the system. So yeah, that was a quick overview of what speciesism is. It's basically just the concept that the humans are the most superior species for whatever reason, and all of the species are on a hierarchy but lower than humans, and they can therefore then be exploited or just treated in ways that we wouldn't treat most other human beings. So yeah.
Amazing. So all my slide headings have seemed to have disappeared, which is interesting. I'm not sure what happened to them. Basically, what this should have said, can you see that, Jam?
I can, yeah.
Okay, cool. I think it's just on my computer. Yeah, so an unnatural occurrence. So essentially what I'm going to dive into now is a little bit about that point that I made before at the start of this about the importance of recognizing the constructed nature. Sorry about that. My computer is not enjoying itself right now. Here we go. Yeah, I'm just going to let it exist by itself. So we're going to start exploring the constructed nature of this idea of our relationship to animals and how it's not a relationship that's built on any kind of like inherent naturalness or anything like that, and how we can start to unpack and start to understand where the system comes from, why it is the way it is, and how we can hopefully work to change it. So I'm going to start by reading an extract from a book by the author and activist and owner, well, kind of runner of Vine Sanctuary, Patrice Jones. This book's called Oxen at the Intersection. It's a fantastic book. I'd really recommend it. But I'm going to read an extract, which is from the very start of the book, which starts to dig into how our relationship to animals kind of came about and the modern-ish origins of this. So hopefully my computer behaves as we start to read this. So feel free to read along as well. We'll also be sending out the slides afterwards. So Interstate 91 snakes north through Connecticut and Massachusetts. I can't pronounce that word. Apologies for those in America. Gradually growing greener and more hilly before entering Vermont, where billboards are illegal and many more trees than people populate the mountains. If you stop in at the Welcome Center in Guilford, you'll see something else that defines the state. A larger-than-life-size photo mural of a smiling blonde boy standing in front of a line of sad-eyed brown cows. Skiers and leaf-peeping tourists notwithstanding, Vermont is dairy country. Even more than the state economy depends on cheddar. The state's psychology rests upon the presumption that blonde boy over brown cow is a natural order of things. Vermonters need to believe that this state of affairs is not only non-injurious, but righteous. It wasn't always that way. Cows came to the Americas with Columbus. For centuries prior to the invasion of the Europeans, human and non-human inhabitants of what would become Vermont co-created ecosystems in which no one species predominated, and nobody claimed to own anybody or the land. The arrival of French fur trappers, intent on profit rather than subsistence, destabilized both social and ecological systems. British colonists rushed into the breach, bringing captive animals with them. The first farmed animals of Vermont labored and died on family farms from which immigrant Vermonters fed themselves and traded locally. But incorporation of the region into the burgeoning global capitalist economy eventually led to specialization. Wool, not milk, was the commodity upon which the new state of Vermont came to depend. So much so that the economy of the region was even more dependent on sheep than the South was on cotton. When demand for wool plummeted in the wake of the Civil War, Vermont's agricultural fortunes crashed until new railroad lines perfectly positioned the state to ship milk to Boston and other fast-growing East Coast cities. It was this economic contingency, the chance combination of a drop in demand for one product and a new opportunity to market a similar commodity, and not any meaningful link between dairying and the mountains of Vermont, that set the state on that path to where it is today. Again, overcommitted to a single product of animal exploitation at a time when demand for that commodity is dropping. As our story begins, Vermont is striving to revitalize its agricultural economy. So essentially, the reason I wanted to read this is to give an example of the historical and constructed nature of many people's relationship to animals. So I know I grew up in an area which had a strong psychological connection to a certain form of use of animals. So for instance, where I grew up, that was also Darien. There's many other places who, there's a strong kind of farming identity, whether it's sheep farming or cow farming. And it can become really easy to see this as just the natural state of things. This is such a big part of these places and these identities. And I think when we start to kind of unpack and look deeper, we can see the constructed roots of this. We can see how our relationship to animals is intrinsically tied to processes of colonization. It's intrinsically tied to, you know, economies and them rising and falling, and how it's tied to other concepts such as ownership, and land land ownership as well. So I want to, just after reading that, I want to hear from some people about what are their reactions to this. When you're hearing that, what did it remind you of, and what did you think and feel? So feel free to just pop some things in the chat, or, you know, if one or two people maybe want to unmute and just say something that came to their mind when reading or hearing this little abstract.
I thought, thank you for sharing this, Harley. I thought this this really like clearly explains like speciesism in so many ways. And what it made me think of is about the colonization of lands, humans, and in the Philippines, and how when the Spanish came and colonized the Philippines, they were doing the same things that Europeans were doing in Vermont. They were displacing the indigenous people there, and creating an economic system and social system, and also bringing non-native animals with them, including cows. And it's based on racism and speciesism for economic reasons.
Yeah, thank you so much, Malaya. Great to hear from you, and also just great to hear that perspective as well about how we can really see this happening all over the world. And I often refer to it as like this idea of like outsourcing destruction. And I think the way animals have been used to kind of outsource this form of destruction is it's really important to understand that, because if we don't understand that, we're missing a whole layer when we're trying to think about global justice and we're trying to think about climate justice as well. It's a whole layer that we can easily miss and not think about. So I'm going to move on to talk about how this kind of transition to an animal agriculture-based economy is not unique to Vermont, as Malaya just kind of pointed out. It can be found in places all over the world, and it is incredibly and deeply linked to the process of colonization. We can see how indigenous food systems all over the world and their ways of interacting with nature and animals were displaced by the practice of agriculture. So in many ways, speciesism was constructed alongside other ideologies. And these ideologies, you know, some of them might be the concept of land ownership, the concept of property status of both humans and animals, the domestication of humans and the natural world, and the process of modern industrial agriculture. So these concepts, they're all constructed, and they were all kind of created to serve a way of living which prioritizes profit, which prioritizes dominance over the natural world rather than subsistence with it. So in her recent book on animal resistance in the global capitalist era, and the author Surat Colling speaks to the process of domestication, stating that contrary to the dominant narratives about domestication enabling human progress, domestication enabled powerful elitist societies that promoted large-scale warfare and violence at different points in history. So I think it's important to note that while we often think about domestication being the taming of the natural world, what we can see if we actually look at domestication across the world, whether that be animals or nature, it led to societies which were built on ownership and where the more you owned, the more kind of power you have. So we can see this where a kind of like living with the land kind of system started to be displaced by modern industrial agriculture. And modern industrial agriculture has always relied on the bodies and the labor of animals and of humans who were treated as lesser. So we see this through, you know, animals pulling plows, animals used as food, slavery, which both historic and modern day slavery. And we can see how the system that we live in is one which is built on the assumption that human labor can be bought and sold, as well as that land, like our environment and our world, and animals can be bought and sold. So the truth is that farming animals require extraordinary amounts of land, meaning that when economies begin to form around ownership and animals begin to be dependent on for food, labor, and militarization, more and more land was needed, more so that could be found in any one country. So we can look at the fires in the Amazon today, where forests are burnt to make way for more cows and what they are fed, as a modern example of this need to conquer and destroy. This comes hand in hand with treating any animals, and I include humans in that, as things to be used or profited from. It is no coincidence, after all, that two of the first living products to be shipped to the newly colonized Australia were convicts and cows. And I think this quote, again by Surat Collins, really captures this understanding of how our relationship to animals is so intrinsically linked to this mentality and this mindset of conquering and domination. So in the mindset of colonizers, all the wild things are available to consume, control, and exploit. Thank you so much, Philip, for putting some resources in the chat. I think that's really great. Sorry, my slides again aren't working. So hopefully, there we go. Animalization and oppression. So for the next bit, I'm going to go into the concept of animalization, which is an idea that some individuals, and this isn't restricted to species, but some individuals have this label and this attachment towards them, which is a process, that we call animalization, that those who are considered closer to animals, and the idea, the categorization of animal becomes a reason for and a kind of a permission to exploit and oppress certain individuals. So in this kind of part of the presentation, I'm going to be drawing a lot from a couple of different authors. So I'm going to be drawing a lot from Ath and Sil Coe, who co-wrote the book Afroism, and also another book written by Ath Coe, which is called Racism as Zoological Witchcraft. And I'm also going to be drawing a lot from the author Sonara Taylor, who's a disability rights and animal liberation activist as well. So I'm happy to share any resources after this as well. So to start off with, this is a funny little image that I found, but I also do think it is really interesting that these are genuine synonyms for animalization: brutalization, animalization, debasement, degradation, delineation, depiction, and I'm not even sure what that last word means, but essentially, like, just through this kind of like thesaurus kind of thing, we can start to see how we view and how we assume the things that we assume about animals, and those that we animalize in our world. So what does animalization mean, and who is animalized? The process of colonizing and exploiting the labor of animals' bodies signposts a deeper process, which is that of animalization. In their book of essays on speciesism, race, and class, Ath and Sil Coe describe animals not as a species-based category, but as a colonial invention that has been imposed on humans and animals. So essentially, kind of like what this means in maybe a bit less not academic language is that we often say, human and animal, we often use animal as kind of like a biological category. But what these authors kind of argue, and what I think is a different way of conceptualizing our relationship to animals, is that animal is no longer a biological category because human is no longer just referring to, you know, our physical species. It's referring to a set of ideas. So animal has become like a constructed conceptual category to describe all those who are not human or are not human enough. So the two sisters explain the vast difference between the biological category of animal, which does include humans, like it's just the kind of category of all those who are animals, so those who are not plants, or kind of other genuses of our world, and the conceptual category, which not only includes all those classified as animal biologically, so non-human animals, so pigs, cows, chickens, etc., insects, birds, but which also includes animalized humans, and these can include people of color, people with disabilities, and women. So the codes detail the history of the human-animal divide as one of domination and conquest, whereas in white Europeans, through this process of colonization, designated themselves and their point of reference as constitutive of being human. So this kind of built the idea of the human and the animal. And this is something that, you know, might seem like a really natural distinction, that we have humans over here, we have animals over there. But what we can see again by looking through, you know, the way this has been developed and constructed is, once again, this is a constructed system. This is not a natural system. This is not a natural divide. And this is not a divide that has existed for as long as there has been humans. So if we look at a lot of, you know, civilizations or even communities today who live outside this kind of industrialized paradigm, what we can see is this way of viewing the world as humans over here and animals over here as this division is not inherent, it's not natural. And in fact, it's, you know, I think it's quite fair and quite easy to say that it's been constructed in order kind of to prop up the system that needs to work a certain way in order to function, that needs to, you know, be a system of exponential growth and a system of resource and like a labor intensive system, and which relies on the unpaid labor of those who are animalized or those who are treated as less than human. So in this like way of creating this category of human and this category of animal, it allowed like these concepts to be weaponized, not only against non-humans, animals, but against marginalized Homo sapien populations. In her book, Beasts of Burdens, animal and disability liberation activist, author, and artist Sonara Taylor describes her own experience of being animalized or bestialized as a disabled woman and the similarities she saw between her plight and those of animals who are treated both as beasts and as burdens. And I think, like, if we think about the animals we might see in our lives, like this is quite I think this is like quite an insightful way of seeing our relationship to animals, that they're often considered to be, you know, beasts and victims, but they're often also considered sometimes to be burdens. They're burdens on the world. Like, you know, I think everyone who's done outreach of any kind has probably been asked that question of, like, you know, but what would happen to all the animals if we didn't eat them? Like, you know, we're the reason that they exist, so they're burdens. So the way we view animals as lesser than human and as deserving of exploitation as a single issue, I think this ignores the way in which animal exploitation sits at the center of the very system we stand against, which is a system that is built on division. It's a system that is built on unpaid labor, primarily of Black, brown, female, and animal bodies, and the belief system that individuals earn their worth by contributing productively to a system of profit and exponential growth, so that everyone needs to earn their way into this system. So I think touching on that is a way of starting to kind of, starting to reconfigure our understanding of animals, our understanding of what it means to be animal, and our understanding of how important it is to kind of think about these things and think about the layers of these conversations in order to, I think, deepen and expand our activism for climate and our activism for animals, and also our understanding of just global oppression in general. Because when we remove animals from the equation, like I said earlier, we are missing a whole layer. We're missing a whole kind of really big piece of the puzzle of why the world is the way it is and why oppression is the way it is. So I'm going to pass it back to Jam now to dive into why does this matter for environmental activists? Why, you know, Animal Rebellion kind of forms the bridge, tries to, between animal justice and climate justice. But it can be easy to get lost and think and forget why it's so important to gain these understandings of speciesism when we're talking about climate justice.
Cool, thank you, Holly. So yeah, so far we've seen how the belief that humans are the most superior species through just because of like certain constructs like animalization and sort of this myth about the humans' will to dominate over over other species, other humans, but then also the nature of the earth has sort of led to the problems that we live through today. And this has created sort of this seemingly real divide between ourselves and nature. And this is just sort of one of these things that a lot of environmental activists will say, that there's a divide now between sort of humans no longer being animals, but then not being a part of nature, and therefore nature or the climate is being destroyed. And the same myths that underpinned things like colonialism and that also underpin extractivism today, of like a fundamental or like divine superiority of the human species, as I've already mentioned, and how this sort of diffused into the space of other oppressions like racism and sexism, ableism, and everything else, and how it's all sort of connected through sort of various concepts. And in a way, we're like quite quick to admit that our greed and our sort of excessive human lifestyles are the cause and like the perpetuator or the catalyst of the climate crisis that we're going through basically right now. And we also understand that the least responsible are the first victims of the climate crisis. But so the purpose of this section is to sort of shine the light on the victims of the global food system, who in plain sight are being exploited, oppressed, and murdered, amongst other things, and sort of the impact that this has on the climate, but then also how this sort of extrapolates itself into other forms of oppression in quite a simple way. But yeah, so if we sort of look at how many animals are victimized each year in the global food system, looking only at animal agriculture. So this data is from 2018, and it's really sort of not the tip of the iceberg, but the base of the iceberg. So it's not completely exhaustive, because there are so many other industries and so many other sort of industries and places that animals are also used for food. But also there's you know, the fur industry and yeah, loads of other industries. But just focusing on animal agriculture, 2018, 1.48 billion pigs perished, 60 or almost 70 billion chickens, 656.31 million turkey, 302 million cattle, 534 almost million sheep, 580 million goats, and then over 2 trillion fish in 1 year were yeah, used for food. So this is a massively huge number, and it's not yeah, like I said, there's not exhausted, but when we sort of start seeing these non-human animals as individuals, we can sort of really connect with the scale of the problem. But then if we then look at sort of not the residual damage, but the other damage that this is causing, not only to the animals themselves, although it does naturally sort of come back to the Earth's ecosystem, which is then also harming more animals and then more humans as well. We can see, in a sense, what's the motive behind this and how speciesism sort of plays its part here. So I'm just going to drop some science, some facts and figures on this, just so we have like a understanding of the problem in numbers, because it's a big problem. So the UN concluded that animal agriculture is responsible for 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that's more than the entire transportation sector. So whilst a lot of people are focusing on cars, electric cars, and sort of transportation using renewable energy, we have something much bigger going on. And this 18% figure is actually one of the most conservative figures available. So it's relatively low to like a lot of other figures, some claiming that it's actually responsible for more than 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. Another paper has recently come out claiming that's 87%, but that sort of hasn't been peer reviewed yet, so we're not sort of going to present it. But it's a massive contributor. Scientists at Oxford University showed that avoiding meat, dairy, and eggs would reduce food related greenhouse gas emissions by 70%. And then there's also sort of the like the amount of resources it actually does take to create meat and dairy. So, for example, it takes about 2.5 thousand gallons of water to produce 1 pound of meat, and 896 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of cheese. So you can see how much sort of goes into producing relatively little. We then have Amazon deforestation. So this is a really big one. And it's not just the Amazon; it's sort of quite global, where deforestation is essentially caused to make room for cattle ranching. So a Yale University study concluded that 80% of the Amazon's deforestation is purely for cattle ranching for mainly meat and other products, but yeah, mainly meat. The World Bank then said it's actually 90%. So it's definitely in the upper quartile, quite significantly, really, but in the 80 and 90% region. So there was another study by World Watch saying that if you take deforestation into account, then animal agriculture is actually responsible for 51% of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is just like sort of the massive impact that animal agriculture has. And this essentially is sort of how the oppression of animals for things like profit and for sort of these based on these constructs of human superiority are really getting out of hand and really exponentially growing since sort of the early days of agriculture. So the problem is just getting bigger and bigger as we speak. The picture on the bottom left is just sort of a visualization over just a 10-day period of forest fires, mainly which are mainly started for deforestation of forests to make room for most of it being cattle ranching. So yeah, you can see most of it's in the global south, and there's a lot of it there. So there's also fishing as well, which has really come under the spotlight now as well, after the recent documentary on Netflix, Seaspiracy. So yeah, this is just copied and pasted from the Animal Equality blog, but if we look at sort of industrial fish farming as well, it causes a bunch of problems as well. So toxic water conditions, because the fish are in there for a long time, so their whole lives, for up to 2 years, and they're confined in really tightly packed spaces. The water becomes toxic, along with things like antibiotics, pesticides, parasites, and feces, and they spread into the surrounding areas, like the surrounding waters, which then sort of contaminate and toxify the oceans, and wild fish populations then also get sick and die as a result. And then, according to another study, a 2-acre fish farm can produce as much waste as a town with 10,000 people in it. Then aquafarming also leads to more fishing. So a lot of the fish species that are raised in aquafarms are predatory species, meaning that they eat other fish, and to feed them, wild fish have to be caught to feed to them. So it's not really solving any sort of perceived problem. Bottom trawling as well, where a boat will take a huge net and wipe the seabed for fish, damages the ocean floor, and the UN estimates that up to 95% of global damage is a direct result of bottom trawling. Longline fishing as well. I'm sure bycatch, so they accidentally catch other species that aren't sort of not the ones they want, and they usually perish, and they're thrown back into the oceans or the sea. Long lines also get lost in the ocean, and they just stay there, and they then go on to sort of kill more animals. Now, if we now look at sort of, as Harley mentioned earlier, like the sheer amount of land used and required for animal agriculture. So we've got this little infographic thing here. So if you look at the second one down, so 71% of the Earth's surface is habitable land, and currently well, not exactly, but half of that is used for agriculture. And 77%, or 3/4 of that, is used for animal for raising animals for meat and dairy, and that is a massive proportion of land being used for that, and mainly because the feed that is needed to feed the animals are also need a lot of land to grow as well. But then the really strange thing is that only 18%, or less than a fifth, of the world's calorie supply comes from meat and dairy, meaning that it's a really sort of inefficient system, and a system where all of the land was used for plant-based food rather than meat and dairy, would feed potentially a lot more people. So if we then go to the next slide. So here we have a quote by Sailesh Rao. So, "The animal agriculture industry is siphoning the vast majority of food for its captive animals, while returning a small amount of animal foods for human consumption. There is nearly a 40-to-1 reduction in dry matter biomass of food going through an animal before it reaches the human plate. And this results in an artificial scarcity." So so what's happening here is that the potential that we have to sort of grow food for everyone in the world is then being reduced down in the rearing of these animals who are oppressed for reasons which are basically just constructs and for profit and things like that, which is what we touched on earlier. And he then goes on to mention that therefore, without animal agriculture, our colonial economic system of artificial scarcities would potentially be transformed into a decolonized economic system of natural abundance. And so this is how sort of animal agriculture is seen to sort of extrapolate itself out into other forms of oppression, essentially, as Sailesh Rao claims, into food scarcity also. Then also, according to a UN study, well, not a study, but like a an article. The calories that are lost by feeding soy, vegetables, and grains to animals instead of using them directly as human food could feed an additional 3.5 billion people. So that's around another half of the Earth's population. So this is sort of the outer ways that the animal agriculture industry, whilst being seen as a sort of a provider of food and a provider of sustenance, is actually sort of doing it the other way around and creating what Sailesh Rao, I believe, rightly calls an artificial scarcity. So yeah. So now, yeah. So we've zoomed out a bit from the individual animal. Unfortunately, we're sort of looking on this big systemic scale with numbers. So yeah, we're going to zoom back in, and Harley's going to talk about animal resistance and animal rebels.
Yes, I am. So yeah, I think something that can be really easy to do, and yeah, thank you so much, Jam. I think it's so important to like see the scale of this and the scope of this, and to see how our relationship to animals like manifests itself on such a big scale, and that it's not just a one-to-one kind of thing. It's not my individual relationship to animals, or everyone's kind of individual way of treating and respecting and thinking about our existence in the world. It's this massive scale, it's this massive thing. But I think it's a big shift that came for me was when I first kind of got involved with, starting to understand all the oppression that happens in the world. I really got stuck in this mindset for a while that there were, people who had the power to make change, and those people were humans, and that there were individuals who we were fighting for and that we had to save, and that it's kind of this like hero mentality, right? That humans made the problems, but we're in the position to fix them as well. And I think a big shift in my thinking was when I started to realize that animals are giving us every day like kind of examples and insight into their preferences and desires. And this is through acts of resistance, acts of rebellion, and acts of not consenting to the system that they have been forced to be part of. And I think the shift that happened for me was stopping seeing animals as victims, as passive, as kind of passive victims to a system of exploitation, and realizing and starting to see them as like co-liberators, and rebellious in their own way, and that recognizing their acts of resistance not as instinctual or just merely biological, but as intentional withdrawing of consent from this system. So we're in the kind of final stretch of this, and I'm going to tell a few stories of animal rebels to start developing that shift, hopefully, in all of our ways of thinking. So hopefully my slides will now work. So I'm going to go back into them. And these are just a couple of stories. They're taken from different places. A few of them come from the book Animal Resistance, by which I'll link in the follow-up email. A few of them come from the more recent book, Animal Resistance in the Global Capitalist Era by Surat Colling. And a couple of them just come from Sanctuaries, which are a fantastic way of seeing and meeting and understanding individual animals rather than animals as concepts or animals as, part of the problem, which is often what we kind of end up with when we're talking about, the environmental movement, where we start to see, start to kind of almost get this like narrow streamlined view of, like this is all the destruction caused by animal agriculture. And we lose that sight of animals as co-liberators, fellow disruptors, and radical earth protectors. So the first image, which is in the top left, this is a pod of orcas, often known as killer whales. And I think like these are some of my favorite examples of this idea of like animals as fellow earth protectors, when we think about the direct action that Animal Rebellion does and Extinction Rebellion does and the civil disobedience, orcas have been known on many occasions to sabotage and attack whaling boats and industrial fishing boats. There's many reasons that there's been hypothesized why they've done this. Some of it is that, you know, these are fish, like industrial fishing boats taking fish out of the ocean. They recognize that and they attack them as they would any other kind of threat to their existence. There's also been kind of known cases of orcas as well as other whales and other marine animals attacking as a sign of retribution, attacking whaling ships after they've killed another whale, or attacking boats that are taking animals out of the ocean for purposes of, you know, taking them to places where they're used for entertainment. So there's this, we can really see how these animals who we often think of as less intelligent, less motivated, less kind of present in the world, I guess, taking action to resist the way they're treated, but also taking action in a way that is showing their desires and how they think the world should be. So if we go to the next picture, so the one on the top right, this is a picture of a horse called Chautauqua, who's from Australia. So Chautauqua was a famous, like very expensive, I guess is the word, sprinter, so in horse racing. And at some point, this horse just stopped running. So yeah, everyone seems like racing, and they open up the gates and all the horses shoot out, and she just stopped and she wouldn't go. And this happened after race, and the people who owned this horse like kept trying again and again because she was worth, like, to them a lot of money, because of her labor and because of the things that she could do for them. So they kept trying. They put her through an extensive like re-education program, so it was known to, which I think we can all imagine what that might have entailed, and the abuse that might have entailed. But every time, without fail, she would get in those gates and they would open and she would refuse to move. And if you can see videos of this, and she's being kicked and hit, and all those things, but she just stands still and like resists this notion that there is something that she should be doing. And I think that's a really powerful demonstration that the purposes that often, again, seem so natural for animals to be in, when they resist, it breaks down that expectation or that understanding that we have that this is the natural way that things should be. So the bottom left, that's a goat named Fred. Fred became quite famous because he not only liberated himself by learning how to open the gate to his pen on a goat farm. So he learned how to do that, and he escaped a number of times. But then he was also observed coming back and teaching other goats how to let themselves out. So yeah, Fred kind of gained a bit of a reputation. Yes, absolutely. That's a Chautauqua. I can probably write it down. I'm not very good at spelling it, but I'll put it in the chat in a second. So yeah, Fred the goat became quite famous for being an animal rescuer, I guess, in his own right. So we can see here how this, you know, when we often think about animals, we can forget that they are not self-centered, individuals, that they think about their friends, they think about their family, and they don't just kind of stop at liberating themselves. And they'll also, thank you, Jan, they'll also return to places of exploitation to support the liberation of others like them and others, their kind of co-captives. And this is just one of many examples. And the final example I'm going to give is these two cows. These are pictures of Clarabelle and Valentine. These are two cows on an animal sanctuary in Australia called Edgar's Mission. And Clarabelle is an ex-dairy cow. And, you know, as I think most of us here know, when dairy cows, for much of their lives until they're killed, they give birth every year, and their calves are then taken from them. So Clarabelle had had that happen to her many times, I think 3 times before she found herself on this sanctuary. And she was pregnant when she came to the sanctuary. And after a while, the people at the sanctuary, when they were feeding the cows and interacting with the cows, they noticed that she'd obviously given birth, but there was no sign of her calf. So they kept coming back every day and there was still no sign of her calf. And eventually they followed her after she'd been fed, and she led them without her knowing that they were following her to a place kind of in some woods with like some trees and like high grass, where she had hidden her calf, her baby Valentine, because she knew that in the past all of her children had been taken away from her. So she did everything that she could to keep this one. And of course, you know, she's at a sanctuary, so she did keep them, and they're still, that's a picture of them. That's Valentine fully grown, and they still, if you go to Edgar's Mission, they still spend most of their time together. So that's Clarabelle and Valentine. The mother is Clarabelle. So yeah, and there's many stories such as this. I've heard of stories of a cow giving birth to twins and hiding one of the calves because they know that they'll be taken, and making that impossible choice to sacrifice one in order to hopefully keep her other. So I think what we see here is these daily, hourly acts of resistance from other animals who we share this world with. And I think through that, like, while it might be, you know, hard at times, I think this provides us with a roadmap in some ways to start to understand how the world could be and how we can work with these visions of a world where kind of we don't act as the dominant species, we don't dominate, we align ourselves with what is kind of just and what is fair. And, you know, at Animal Rebellion, like, we always talk about a just, sustainable plant-based food system. And I think it's important to recognize that when we say that, we don't just mean that the whole world, that the kind of the it's not just the plant-based part, it's the just part and the justice part. And I think these stories of animal rebels, which Animal Rebellion is inspired and motivated by, gives us clues into what that just part might look like. So the final thing I want to talk about before we get into discussion is anti-speciesism, which seems like an important thing to talk about in a workshop on speciesism. So I think it's a question of, what does it look like to live in an anti-speciesism world? And how can we and how do we practice anti-speciesism right now? So this is the kind of like discussion that we'd like to end things on. So I want everyone to have a little think about what if, like, we've talked a lot about what this system of exploitation and oppression and how it relates to our world, how it's not just a separate kind of thing that we kind of can choose to think about or not, how it's intrinsically linked to so many other things that we're talking about and to this system that we're trying to change. But I think it's important as well to think about, what is this vision? How can we live this vision right now? And I have some ideas, and I'm sure Jam has some ideas as well. But I think it would be really great to open this up and hear from everyone. So we're going to do that at the end. I have a couple more slides to get through first, but like just literally a couple more. So have a think now about your reflections on this workshop, on this presentation, and also on this question of what does it mean to be anti-speciesist. So I'll come back to that in a minute, and we'll all be able to have a conversation and a discussion to kind of finish things off. But before that, a couple of ideas that I came up with was being aware of our relationships to animals and challenging our notion of what is natural. Starting to explore and investigate how the issues we are passionate about are connected to other issues. Building alternative models of human-animal relationships through our lifestyle changes, and including animals in conversations around justice. I think that when we're talking about speciesism, it can be quite easy to become very disillusioned. It's such a massive, massive topic, and it's heartbreaking in a lot of ways. And I'm sure like all of us are here because of the passion and the compassion that we feel about these kind of issues. So I wanted to finish with a little bit of a reminder that the reason this matters is because we all believe in justice. And when we understand the roots of injustice, we can fight division in our movements. We can fight this kind of like instinct to divide and conquer and to believe that it's a zero-sum game, that, you know, some in order to kind of get justice for some, we have to forego justice for others. And I just don't think that's true at all. I think justice is infinite, and we can build justice for all while in everything that we do. But I think it's also important because when we understand and when we recognize the roots of this system, we can start to think of ways of breaking it down and making it unviable. And that's what we do, and that's what we try and do every day when we're, you know, planning actions, when we're planning spaces and communities. So I want to end by recognizing, and in this, hopefully this will become in the discussion as well, that while this is so big in scale, I think it's also there's so much potential, because when we realize that this is a constructed system, we also recognize that it can be reconstructed and it can be reconfigured. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And I want to end with the notion that when we reconceptualize our own relationship with animals, and when we have these conversations about how we can do that and how we can understand animals as co-liberators, as sanctuaries, as spaces of resistance and rebellion, as our understanding and kind of like expands about the roots of injustice, we can really start to act from a place of collective liberation, from justice for all, of freedom for all. And I think that's an incredibly powerful place to be in. And I think when we start having these conversations, when we, you know, I know we all are having these conversations in many different ways and in many different spaces, like it really expands our ability to take powerful action and to take meaningful action. So I'm gonna stop talking there. And I don't know, Jam, if you want to say anything else. But yeah, I think like mainly we just really want to open it up into discussion. And I think we have until 8 here. We don't have to go that long. We can, you know, hear from as many people as we want, and just really kind of start that conversation about what does it look like to challenge these systems, and what does it look like to have these conversations, and also just anything that you thought of, any reflections, anything you want to add as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and yeah. Feel free to put a hand up or put something in the chat. Yeah, Alison?
I was just going to say, as anything, because arguably the whole of our society and every single behaviour that we do in every form, in every way, and all aspects of society is made up by us. We make up all the rules, we make up all the laws, we make up the institutions, we make up how we interact with the institutions, etc., etc. So you totally agree about recreating, you can call it narratives, or recreating our relationship in any way, shape or form to any aspect of nature and animals. And it can just be rewritten. That was really it. I'm a sociology teacher, so it's kind of natural to think of how everything's made up. Human beings make up everything. So therefore we can deconstruct everything as well and create anew. And I think that's the incredibly positive thing about this.
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? It's like it's all made up in our heads, and when we come together as communities, we can make something else up. We can, yeah,
absolutely, yes. And I do it in my daily life and a lot of my interactions with a lot of people, with my students, etc. Yeah.
From Philip in the chat. Do you mind if I read it out, Philip? A key concept that touched on has been is animal resistance. By extension, our moral obligation as fellow sentient beings to stand in solidarity and support their liberatory struggles. How I see us living this anti-species vision begins with being a voice for other animals, for we are animals as well, and incorporating animal justice in activism founded on consistent anti-oppression for all sentient beings. The failure to do not only fails the animals, but contributes to our own alienation. And quote, in oppressing our kin, other animals, we become estranged from ourselves, placing ourselves in perpetual flight from our own embodied desire and suffering and potentially rational selves. Yeah, I think that's a really, really important, well, it's a beautiful quote, but it's also a really important point to make. Was that a hand, Sammy? No.
Oh, Harley,
Yeah.
I'd like to make another comment. And so like I really appreciate that you mentioned in one of your slides about the idea that wild things are to be exploited. That wild things are to be exploited, and that is kind of that idea and that way of thinking is like a crux of animal exploitation and animal agriculture. And then it reminds me of the exoticization of brown and Black people in whiteness, in the social construct of whiteness, and the viewing of brown and Black people as primitive, and how that relates to the construction of human zoos. In I'm not sure if you are aware of them, that there were human zoos in North America and in Europe, and that there are still some human zoos, but it's not as common as it used to be, and that it was paternalistic, and their views that it was educational, and that like white people would buy tickets to take their children to these human zoos because they wanted their children to see like a Filipino or an African or something like that. And they thought it would be a good opportunity to teach them of these other cultures. And they didn't, and it's how it's actually othering. It's othering. And then it's racist and it's speciesist. And it's like, it was also used, Filipinos were taken from their homes in the Philippines in human zoos and used to justify US colonization of the Philippines. And it goes along with the whole beast and burden thing that you were talking about.
Thank you so much, Malaya. Yeah, no, I hadn't actually heard too much about that. So I think that's like really horrible, but really kind of, like such an important point as well. And I think it ties into, I think I very briefly mentioned, like slavery of humans being both historic and modern day. And I think, like when we think about animalization, it's not just a historic thing that like people who are considered like less than human, like humans who are considered that way, were treated in these ways. So I think that's such an important point. Thank you so much. Sammy?
Yeah, wow. I wanted to say thank you, and all the comments are amazing. I was thinking, Holly, I just wanted to really say I appreciate the animal resistance part of this, because I think that really triggers like the knowledge that this is something that needs to change. And we do often see all the animals, which they are, as victims, we only see that. And when I was a kid, I grew up in farmland and heard pigs screaming, and people told me, and I was worried about them, there's something wrong, we should do something. They're like, no, they're just crazy, wild. They're, we have to treat them this way. And I think it's really interesting that so many humans would understand screams as being resistance and important to recognize the more we talk about it. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's such an important point, that like, we can think of resistance as the things I mentioned, but also just, screaming. Like I used to, for my sins, I used to ride horses for most of my adult, like childhood life. And every day, like when you're doing that, you're taught that the horse like resisting you as a sign of your own failure, and that you should be stronger and more dominant and things like that. And I think like looking back on that as an adult, and having like these theoretical but also like practical and emotional frameworks to understand that, and realizing that, yeah, like animals quite clearly tell us what they want out of life. And I think that's really important. And yeah, thank you so much, Sammy. I think like something that I know that for me, like my background on my computer, it's a picture of my bunny who I rescued. And it's a quote from an article which I actually said in the presentation, which is that sanctuaries could be considered spaces for staging resistance. And I think like that's like a daily reminder for me that like our relationship with animals and rescued animals isn't just a, yeah, like a paternalistic, as Malaya put it, like, oh, we'll take care of you. It's a revolutionary act, and it's a rebellious act to be like, we're standing with these animal rebels and taking action with them. So yeah. I think Philip and then Tracy, I don't know if you.
Sure. So first of all, thank you again. That was a really great presentation, and it's just so heartening to hear this message being kind of framed, you know, centered in Animal Rebellion content. And I just want to first acknowledge, like, and you touched on this, but just how difficult this is because of the deeply speciesist civilization into which we were born. I mean, it's almost unfathomable, you know, at times that people, you know, and I'm active in like other social justice, you know, who are circles and movements who, you know, get it. Oh yeah, you anti-racist, anti-sexist, etc. And then you bring up the animal question and their face, that look we all know so well. So I just want to, you know, acknowledge that and with appreciation for you and Jim stepping up where you have. I guess my question is, given, you know, your work here and the way you show up in Animal Rebellion doing messaging work, how is this, you know, first principle and value message of anti-speciesism being incorporated into Animal Rebellion's messaging?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a really good question. I don't know if you want to answer that, this Jam, or I can speak to it.
Yeah, I'm trying to formulate my thoughts on this because I have thought about this. I just need to, yeah, because I haven't looked at messaging for a couple of weeks. But if Holly, you want to answer, then I could come maybe with my perspective.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's something that we're really working on, the messaging team at the moment, and we're working on how to do that. And I think like the most recent example is, yeah, like we're trying to work with that in the messaging around G7. So having this like dual messaging of like holistic climate messaging, like climate justice messaging, which includes animals. So bringing like kind of showing this like global solidarity and showing like that there is this big picture to climate justice that's not just about, you know, environmental exploitation, but including animals in that framework of justice, but then also having like animal specific messaging, and that's really rooted in animal resistance, and how like that attempt for solidarity. So I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at the G7 messaging doc, Phil, but I think like that's an example of how we are trying to do that quite actively. But yeah, of course, like always open to feedback and improvement. And I think it's just an ongoing conversation of how we do that and how we build that in. Yeah, do you want to add to that, Chan?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I was thinking about the G7 messaging as well, and the COP messaging as well. I think we've released that, but yeah, it's about sort of bringing sort of this notion of an animal, non-human animal, as an individual, but then sort of finding a way to really extrapolate that and merge that into like this sort of systemic narrative that we have, because Animal Rebellion has like really historically been about the system, mainly I think not because we didn't want to have animals in the spotlight, but mainly because we didn't want to sort of blame individuals for the choices. So we really wanted to have it focused on the system. And so as Holly mentioned, we're bringing sort of what I call like the ethical and moral core, which is the individual animals who are suffering, into that now with, as Holly mentioned, sort of animal messaging on side, because we do think that now after a few years of animal rebellion, we do need to sort of have that sort of shining in there alongside the sort of the systemic narratives. But then further onto that, I think one of the things we sort of came up with recently, it's just a bit of a tagline, but I think it does it quite. Someone wants to join, Giovanna. Cool. And where, so there's a lot of talk by, I think, some, I said talk in like a really content way, but there's a lot of conversation about a just transition for sort of global systems, and one of them being the agriculture system, which I think, from what I've read, is going to be sort of spotlighted at COP at least, and where then, as you mentioned, Phil, we talk about oppressed humans and all these other things, but then when animals are brought into the frame, people are like, okay. So what we've done is sort of where there's a narrative of like a just transition, we're saying a just transition must be plant-based as well, just to sort of, in a way, systemically bring the animals into the picture by taking them outside of the picture, if you know what I mean. So by saying, as Holly mentioned, it's still something we're working on, and it is pretty complicated, I think. But yeah, and if you have any feedback, then or any suggestions at all, then and that goes for anyone here, do feel free to reach out. So we're always like receptive to feedback, and we always like really appreciate it. So we're doing our best, and if anyone does have any ideas or like some epiphanies on how we could do this, then that'd be awesome.
Thank you both. Just really briefly, I know how difficult this is, and there was a comment I think Holly made about, or maybe it was Jim, I'm not recalling, about serving as a bridge, and just how like it's so ambitious and so like challenging to bridge that gap when no one else is doing that. And I think it's a tribute to the people who really stepped up, Dora and others at Extinction Rebellion, and said, we really need to take this on. And, and it's a challenge for all of us, I think, or many of us here are engaged deeply in this really challenging work. So I just want to salute everybody for that. And I'm going to put in chat, I had an occasion to write a brief article on Animal Rebellion for Forca Vegan at VegFest UK. And I to this point, and I'll stop talking, I said, this may be the most consequential justice movement in the world because of this challenge, this massive, given the impacts of animal agriculture on the climate, given the massive suffering, et cetera. It's really hard stuff. So I just want to salute everybody and thank you again for your service. I'll put it in the chat.
Thanks so much, Phil. And like I said, I'll include all these links in the follow-up email. So that's awesome. Tracy, did you want to?
Yeah, I guess my comment has kind of changed because Philip and Jam have covered a lot of it. I really appreciate you doing this, Harley and Jam, because I came here kind of hoping to get some advice on how to spread this message of anti-speciesism, particularly to an audience who is not familiar with it or maybe prepared to receive it. And it is a real challenge, I think, for all of us, I suppose. It's not just in Ireland where we have this problem. And I really liked seeing that picture you put up, Harley, of the Animal Rebellion protest, and somebody was holding a sign that said, they are all individuals. And I was thinking maybe that is something that we really have to try and focus on, because alongside the thing about animal resistors, or whatever you called them, animal rebels, I feel like the overwhelming majority of the animals who are caught up in this system are not able to show their resistance. And the system is constructed in such a way that we don't see that. We don't know about their lives. And if they were even able to show any resistance, we are, that is closed off from us. And so I feel like to get across that message, and I was thinking about the movie Gunda, for anybody who saw that, where you saw the mother pig, and I won't spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but you really get a sense of an individual, of an animal as an individual. And so I feel like that is maybe something, you know, like you are already highlighting it, but maybe that's a good way to go, because I find that the greenhouse gas emission statistics are impactful and awful, and yet also give hope if we can bring in a plant-based system. I feel like that dilutes the moral argument. Like, that's about us and what's good for us and how, you know, we can feed ourselves and make the world a better place. But I really feel like I feel that the animals are missing when I hear all those statistics. So those are just my comments. But thank you very much for this. I found this really useful.
Thanks so much, Tracy. I think, yeah, it's such an important point, right? That I think something that we've, from the very beginning, that's been like in Animal Rebellion's like frame, I guess, is animals as individuals. And it's, I think, doing that and like showing that sometimes, yeah, it can get lost sometimes in like trying to show the scale. So I think like it's so important to have both of those layers and both of those levels. And just to kind of like a comment on like the pictures that like Jam and I use, and like we were actually having a conversation about this because like most of the images that we use were from like the We Animals archive. So I don't know if people know like Joanne MacArthur. Yeah, I'd really recommend looking with them. She's a really incredible like photographer who has this amazing, yeah, there we go, archive, which anyone like can use like for free. And it's has all these images, and what she does is like she really captures the heart and the individual nature of animals. And Jam and I, yeah, like I said, we're having a conversation about how it's quite challenging, like outside of that, to find images, like yeah, even images of animals that have that kind of like individuality expressed. Yes, really amazing book. So yeah, Jam.
Yeah, really thanks for that, Tracy. And I completely agree that when we sort of, abstract the issue into numbers, yeah, we're just sort of talking, yeah, just numbers. And yeah, I spoke about such in my workshop that I did a while ago, strategic messaging. So essentially, it's a sort of a way that we would sort of try to bridge the sort of the animal emergency into the climate emergency. But yes, so that wasn't really the purpose of that, was to try to obscure that. It was just sort of to yeah, find that bridge in certain ways. But in doing so, then we do sort of use like the same thinking mechanisms of what's causing the problem, which is what, you know, reducing animals and some humans into numbers and sort of making yeah, everything into a scale. But yeah, totally on your page with that also. Yeah.
I wanted to say that yeah, I really think that one of the reasons why it's difficult to address speciesism with people with non-vegans is that they could have a difficult time empathizing with the animals. And then I think one of the reasons behind this is something that you mentioned, Harley, that we have these ideas, speciesism is based on ideas about the natural order of things. Like, this is the way this has always been, for example, which is a myth, right? Like we haven't, like animal agriculture, the way that it's practiced now in South America, that was brought there by the Spanish, for example, and in the Philippines and things like that. And so I was thinking, like, I was just kind of like brainstorming actions and stuff and thinking about things during this presentation. And with the Animal Rebels section of the presentation, where you mentioned the story about the orca pod, the orca pods like interfering with the actions of like fishing boats. I was thinking that like using that piece as part of maybe an action about the fishing industry, and then kind of like as part of the action, or maybe like telling part of the story, sort of. And then that could also help people see that you know, this is not the natural order of things. Animals, where they're not willingly being exploited. They want to live and they're resisting, and we should fight alongside with them for their rights to exist and for this planet and for each other. And yeah, so I think I'd like to use images in that story. So yeah, and also in the light of, like, you know, with the how the Seaspiracy documentary came out, this would be a good opportunity also to highlight the fishing industry and like and kind of like you know with all of that attention that people are focused on with that. So
Absolutely, yeah, no, such good points, and yeah, like really cool ideas as well. Yeah, I think like when we're talking about empathy as well, like I think fishers get the worst, kind of the short end of the stick with this, like when we're thinking about trying to kind of get people to expand their circle of compassion. And you know, like we know that like the number of fishers killed isn't even counted in like numbers, it's counted in weight. So just things like that, like I think it's so important to talk about that and to recognize like individuals in those areas as well. So we'll start to wrap up, I think, because yeah, it's been such a great discussion, and I'm sure there's so much, there is, I know, so much more to discuss, but yeah, is there anything else that people want to say before we say our goodbyes? Yeah, David, please.
Sorry, it's another question.
Awesome.
It might be a really stupid one. I feel like it's a bit of a silly question, but I was wondering, where do pets fit in an anti-species world? So like, if you think about, I mean, it's a bit of a gray area. I imagine it's really hard to answer, because you kind of, like, when you have pets, I mean, they're nice to have, obviously, but then you come to that argument where you own them and they're a commodity that you can trade. So I was wondering, in an anti-species world, would we have pets? Yeah, that's my question.
I think that's such a great question, and yeah, I might have seen me rubbing my hands because I love these kind of discussions. So I wanted to ask, actually, if anyone else here might want to respond to that. I know, Phil, you have a lot of individuals who live with you and who you care for, so I was wondering, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. I know I have my perspectives on this, but yeah, I want to throw it open if anyone has anything they'd want to add to this conversation.
Yeah, I've been also thinking about the same thing a lot lately, and discussing speciesism with family or friends. It can often seem like it's a alien concept to them, and then you have to kind of put it into ways, like more digestible ways and everything, in a very sort of compassionate way. Because if you start to get all kind of judgy with them, then you know those walls go up and everything. But yeah, in terms of pets, I've been training myself to not see the dog and the cats as pets, but more like extended family kind of thing. So most people that would seem weird, but yeah, like extended sort of non-related kind of family or friends kind of thing. But yeah, it's funny how a few of them were quite a lot of them weren't rescues. So that's another thing. Like, are they adopted from shelters, or are they bred by breeders? That's another thing. So my family hasn't always adopted or rescued, and some of them have been from like very exceptional situations. You know, they wouldn't go to a puppy mill or anything like that, but only be in exceptional circumstances. Then, let's say we got the dog who's a black Labrador from a breeder, and so yes, it's really interesting. Like, and it's just about educating each other that they're not just there for our pleasure, but they're there to share the home. And you know, in a way, I believe that we can make sure it's on a happy mutual terms rather than just for humans. So as long as you're hopefully giving those non-human animals as much of the giving them as good as they're giving you, or if you're giving better to them, I don't think there's anything unethical to do with that. But yeah, just always try to do it for good grounds in terms of adopting if and when possible. So that's just my penny's worth. And also another quote from Winnie the Pooh, sorry, it's that recently, as well as because it's the World Day for Animals in Labs, there's lots of things going around on that, but there's another like more wholesome sort of quote from Winnie the Pooh that's many people talk to animals, but many people don't listen. So that's quite interesting, something to think about.
Thank you so much, Rowan. I think James or Malaya have something to add, and then Phil.
Oh, I wanted to say that I feel like there's a lot of similarities with the whole idea of pets and like sexism. I personally don't think there's anything wrong with like companion animals. I think there's a difference though, definitely between companion animals and pets. So like, because in my mind, I see like having a pet as like a form of exploitation. A form of exploitation that's kind of just like disguised as like love or something like that. And I feel like one of the similarities between like having pets and like objectification of women is like is also about like appearance, like how animals are bred, who are bred for us to have them as pets, for them to have a certain appearance, for a certain aesthetic, for their for ideas about like, you know, them being cute and that it's paternalistic, and yeah, like controlling their lives, separating the babies from their moms, the sexual exploitation too with the breeding.
Thank you so much, Malaya. Phil? Oh, you muted.
I had muted. One of the comments that Rowan made about rescue. So Harley and James and Malaya know that, and my wife and I half kidding would say a de facto micro sanctuary for rescue greyhounds. So all of our fur beings in the house, currently 4, are all rescued from the racing industry. So they were bred as commodities into captivity, and so as a reason by our species. So we kind of view it as a moral obligation to because they're here now. So with a responsibility to care. So that's kind of informs our relationship with them. And we obviously, you know, have a deep affection and love for them as members of our family. But that's decidedly distinct from human beings breeding animals into existence to be, you know, commodities, like in the form of a pet or, you know, entertainment. I stand against that unequivocally. They're entirely different things. These animals that were bred as commodities, horses for racing, dogs, laboratory animals. I know beagles are often adopted out from and other animals from laboratory experiment, and that's absolutely horrible. And just briefly, I'll mention and terribly inefficient. You know, I've done some work with organizations that are standing against vivisection because it actually, not only is it just horrific, and that's really the roots of the animal justice movement actually is in anti-vivisection work, right? But it's also terribly inefficient and inaccurate. So just to put that out there, but the key point is that under no circumstances do I support, you know, the breed, you know, pure breed dogs, for example, being used as pets or any other animal, and that's a distinction that must be maintained in my mind. Rescue is one thing, and breeding for a purpose that's aesthetics or what have you is completely unacceptable.
Thanks so much for everyone who contributed. I'll just say one more thing on this. So I think like it is really interesting because I think it kind of ties to the core of like human animal relationships in general. And I think like sometimes we can, almost go to the other extreme of like, yeah, any relationship with like a non-human animal is exploitation. I think like in some ways that's true. But I also think like it is interesting that like the process of domestication for many species started out of one of mutual cooperation. So for example, like wolves, like the process of them beginning to be domesticated into our modern dogs started because like humans and wolves began to live in like these symbiotic ways and stuff. So, and if we look at like the natural world as well, like the kind of, the world that we live in, there isn't distinct species barriers. Like there's definitely like species kind of keep to their own, but like we do see a lot of interaction between species. And I think like in a hypothetical anti-species world, humans would be one species among many. So we wouldn't own or control other species, but we would still interact with them and have fulfilling and meaningful relationships with them in some ways. And I do think it's like everything that has been touched on is so critical and important. And I think one of the key things is, that recognition of like where we are and like the world that we live in. And I think Phil said it really great of like that moral obligation, I guess, some ways to care for those who are here because of us. And I think also it would be remiss, which is my new favorite word, to dismiss the like incredible richness that other animals like bring to our lives. And I think, it's kind of that difference, right, between seeing ourselves as dominant and superior and controlling, and seeing ourselves as having the potential to care for those who are here because of us, and who, but then also to kind of hopefully like bring joy into their lives and like build like that interspecies like relationships as well.
Harley?
Yeah.
Maybe we could instead see non-human animals or other species of animals as our siblings, as like our brothers and sisters, and as our comrades in fighting injustice.
Seeing a lot of wavy hands there, so amazing. We have, 5 minutes left. So any final reflections or thoughts from people before we, David, and then Jam?
Yeah, just thanks for the answers. That's really helpful to think of. Like maybe pets is actually just a really unhealthy word to use. Maybe just think of, like, as you're saying, the relationships that we have. Think of them as companions, family, adopting as well. That's quite a nice way of thinking about animals and our relationship with them. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Jam, do you want to go?
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry. Just touching on, I think what was discussed earlier about sort of vivisection and like the use of animals in like lab testing and stuff, and how it's inefficient, as in like the results aren't accurate and there's no sort of real reason to do it. There is a book I read called it's a dodgy, complicated philosophy book by Jean Baudrillard. But he had a chapter on the animals, and I think he explained it in a really cool way. So I'm gonna maybe it's quite a long extract, and but maybe I'll post it in the thing and you can read it if you want. But I think it's really cool. And I just want to touch on also what was mentioned earlier about how sort of big this is, on how really we're really going to sort of like the real depths of the underworkings of modern civilization to try and sort of turn this around. And I personally would really like to explore like how we can sort of really challenge and discredit these assumptions, like because we said everything's made up by humans, but these things that are made up are based on other things like made up by humans, which are based on other things that were made up by humans, which essentially I guess like reduced down to like some sort of some a priori thing which isn't even real. And I feel like that this is what we're challenging, and it's a big job, but I think we'll do it. We'll get it done.
Yeah, with a group like this, how can we fail? Amazing. So yeah, that kind of like it brings us to the end of tonight, but I think the beginning of hopefully many more conversations. And Jam and I are hoping that this won't be the last time, just the first time that we run this presentation. So yeah, hopefully we'll kind of be doing it again and opening up more discussions. I don't know, like I recognize some of you, I don't recognize all of you, but if you're not currently kind of like involved in Animal Rebellion and want to get more involved, in the follow-up email, I will send some links to like our G7 pledge, as well as all the resources and that. So it might be a bit of a long one, so prepare yourself. But also just feel free to like reach out to me or Jam or anyone else here to talk about how we can connect and get involved. I'm going to put my email in the chat. And also I'm lazy, so yeah, there we go. So if you do want to get into, I was going to say I'm lazy, so all my follow-up emails are through my personal email account. So you just reply if you want to have a chat. And yeah, it's a fantastic idea, Philip, really good idea. So yeah, let's keep going. Let's keep the conversation going. And so great to see you all. Jam, do you want to finish off?
Yeah, really sorry. So yeah, so I mentioned that this is just sort of not the end of the conversation and stuff. And personally, I think Harley will agree as well. I kind of want this to be like a co-working type of thing. So so get in touch, and if there's any sort of any topics and any resources that you want to touch on and stuff like that, just send them across, or even send us a message on Telegram or whatever, or talk about it, and we can sort of add that in. And if you want to present as well, that's totally cool as well. So whatever you want, you're just welcome to contribute in any way you want. And so I think it's hit 8 o'clock. It is Sunday evening where we are anyway, and so thanks so much everyone, and got to thank Holly for making the amazing presentation. I was just sort of Holly's sidekick and stuff, but I really enjoyed it, and really thank you everyone for coming, and really looking forward to seeing you all again in the future when we can continue this. And so big love to all of you, and enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll be back. So
bye everyone.
Thank you so much. Great to be with everyone. Thanks again.
Thanks so much for coming, Phil. It was great to see you.